Hello, everybody, and welcome to this presentation. Today, I'll be presenting on the wines of the world, these unsung heroes, places that either make some really good wines or might make some good wines in the future and don't get any of the credit. We spend a lot of time talking about these wine giants and not enough about these little guys. So I just wanted to shine a spotlight on them. And let's get into it. My name's Phineas, and let's get started. So like I said, the objective of this presentation is going to be to shine the light on some places that have some amazing wines and get none of the coverage that I personally think that they deserve. And first off, we're starting strong with Lebanon. So Lebanon is actually really interesting. They've had wine for a really long time. The Phoenicians and the Romans introduced wine to the region around 700 BC. So it's a really similar time frame to when they were really populating all of Europe with wine and getting that culture started elsewhere. So a lot of these other places and Lebanon, France, Italy, these places that are Spain even, that are regarded as major wine giants, they started about the same time as Lebanon, but there's a little bit of a difference in obviously how much you hear about a French wine versus a Lebanese wine. They've got some really old, really impressive vineyards as well. Chateau Cassara was founded in 1857 by Jesuit monks, and it makes some of the best wines in the region. More recently, in 1977, Chateau Moussard was established, and that is producing probably some of the better wines in the region. And they are being mass produced. So they have actually quite a large market there for their wine. Probably a little bit larger than Chateau Cassara at this point, but still some world-class wines that are being produced and sent all over the world. So what sets them apart from other wines that you may have had are the spice palette. That Middle Eastern spice palette is really intense and really flavorful. And they add a lot of that into the wines that they make there in Lebanon. In addition, there can be notes of incense, some wood, sandalwood in particular, some licorice, just these tasting notes that maybe you've had one or the other in different wines that you've experienced. But it's rare to find all of those in some of these, especially the red wines that they're making there in Lebanon. Really flavorful and really, really explosive on the palate. In addition to that, they have many different microclimates. So in general, they're right there on the Mediterranean. So they have the benefit of the Mediterranean climates. Most people who know wine know that having a Mediterranean climate creates some of your better wines, some of the best wine growing conditions that you can make. But they've got a couple of different wine regions, even within Lebanon. Most famous of those wine regions, definitely, however, is going to be the Bekaa Valley. So the Bekaa Valley is really famous, especially for some of the wines that they make. It uses its own water supply. So from snowmelt from the nearby mountains. So that actually provides all of the water that is made, that is used to make the wine and grow the grapes in those regions. So it's snowmelt, which is really interesting. Not a lot of irrigation that happens. It just comes down from the mountains. Alternatively, the terroir is fairly similar across it. They have fairly calciferous soil throughout most of Lebanon. So while there are different finishing touches that are put in places in these different wine regions and different grapes that are grown, that underlying terroir is really going to be what's bringing a lot of that backbone and a lot of flavor to these wines. But some of them end up being, like I said, quite excellent wines that really deserve a little bit more credit. So next up, we have Hawaii. I know that Hawaii isn't a country, trust me, but it's a state that people don't think of when they think of wine production. When you think of American wine production, you're thinking California, you're thinking Oregon, you're thinking Washington State, maybe even Virginia, but you're definitely not thinking Hawaii. And let's get into a little bit of why maybe you should. So they have only two vineyards or two commercial vineyards in all of Hawaii, but the most famous of which is Volcano Winery. And it benefits from volcanic terroir. There are not a lot of places that can say that they grow grapes on an active volcano or very near to an active volcano. It adds a lot of interesting flavor. It's different rock, different soil than is in most places, and it makes some really high quality wines. Additionally, they use very atypical grapes on the most part. The symphony grape and the Cayuga white grape in particular are being grown there because it's a very different climate from most places. It's really hard to grow the typical grapes. With that being said, it is a rapidly evolving wine culture. Excuse me, there are people who are attempting to cultivate more traditional grapes and Pinot Noir grapes in particular. And they're trying to see if they can create new ways to make more traditional wines and also to find new ways to use traditional grapes to make non-traditional wines. But it's really an interesting experiment in what can be done with wine in some of the most extreme conditions. And it's really interesting to track and see how it's going. Next up, we have Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia is another interesting case where they've been making wine for a long time. The first vineyards were planted there centuries ago and have been around for a long time. However, what's happening now that's really interesting is as other foreign people are getting more invested and more interested in Ethiopian wines, they're bringing in some of the more old school grapes. So there are grapes being brought in from Bordeaux in particular, but French grapes that are being brought in, and they're being hybridized with the grapes that were already there, which are creating essentially new grapes, really new flavors, things that haven't been tasted before. And it's creating a really interesting result. Awash Winery deserves a shout out. They're the oldest winery that's been established in the modern era, so not centuries ago. They've been around for a while, but not that long. And they're making some really high quality wines. Those are available worldwide. You can find wines from Awash Winery, even in American wine stores, and all over Europe as well. And like I said, that foreign investment is interesting because not only is it adding new grapes and new techniques to old Ethiopian techniques and Ethiopian wines, but it's also creating more of a world market for those wines. By having that foreign investment, by having people who are interested in building the market, it'll be interesting to see how that affects the palate of the wine and if the wine changes at all or if the wine stays the same and just receives better marketing. So that'll be interesting to see moving forward. Next up, we have India. Now, India, again, another nation that has been making wine for a really long time. Persian traders in 2000 BCE brought some of the first wine production techniques over, and they've been making wine ever since. In the 1850s, it was huge under British rule. British loved their wine, and they couldn't grow it themselves. So they would grow grapes in India, and they would use it to make wine, and then they would ship it back to Britain. But in the early 1900s, there was a worldwide phylloxera epidemic. So this was rotting grapes worldwide at about the same time. It spread throughout the very late 1800s and early 1900s and really knocked out a lot of grapes all over the place. And India also fell victim to this. So they had a bit of a setback in their industry. But in 1980s, their wine production returned and has really been booming since then. It's been getting back, maybe not to exactly where it was, but certainly it's become huge again in the country. And they have some world-class wineries now, particularly Sula Vineyards. They create wines that are nationwide in America. They can be found in Great Britain. They can be found all over Europe. These are really popular, really good vines, and they really are high quality. They have a more classic style of wine. They have some Cabernet Sauvignons, some Bordeaux style blends, some Syrahs that are really high quality, that are really world renowned. But also they've been doing a lot of innovation in India. It's a very different climate, obviously, than most places that you think of when you're thinking of growing wine. So they've been really, particularly in sparkling wines, it's been interesting to see their developments. They've been making a Chenin Blanc Brut and a Syrah Zinfandel Rosé, both of those sparkling, obviously. And it's really been interesting. There's not the standard Chardonnay and Pinot Noir style Bruts that you would see most other places. So it's been interesting to see them adapt to their own unique terroir, to their own unique climate in the way that they're creating their wines. And it'll be interesting to see how they continue to do that moving forward. Next up, we have Sweden. Now, Sweden is just barely emerging into the wine market. They don't have a lot going on, but that is because until recently, it was too cold to grow grapes that made good wine in Sweden. Well, as a semi-fortunate benefit of a very unfortunate scenario when it comes to climate change, it's now getting warmer, and they're actually able to make wines that are increasing in quality. And they've had a very rapid growth of that industry. They've had from relatively nothing in the early 2000s and the late 1990s to over 40 commercial vineyards now. And that's really rapid growth, and it'll be interesting to see how they progress. They share a lot of parallels actually with the English wine business. So in England, they also have a similar cold, not very hospitable climate when it comes to growing grapes, but they were able to find a niche in creating some really good sparkling wines. So it'll be interesting to see if Sweden becomes a country like that, where they're able to really find their niche and create some high quality wines, or if they'll remain a little bit more marginal, like they certainly are right now. They're not a big player, but it'll be interesting to see if they can become one later on. Now we go from Sweden, who is really just getting started, to China, which is very well established. Now they've been around for a while. They've had wineries established as early as the 1890s, and they've just continued their growth from that point. They've got a mostly domestic market still, but it is rapidly expanding to become a global market, particularly in places like Great Britain. And even in some places in the Americas, you can find some Chinese wines. They were one of the top producers of wine last year. They were in the top 10, and I believe that they were 7th as of 2015. So they're really breaking into these top levels of wine production. And part of that is due to this cultural passion for wine that's being established in China. There's a high demand for the top vintages. Bottles are selling fast. And that internal passion for wine culture is creating some really high quality wines that are going to break out into the global market soon. And when they do, China might rapidly become one of the leading wine producers in the world. Next up, we have Japan. So Japan actually also has a pretty storied tradition of winemaking. They've been making wine for centuries. They have unique styles, unique blends. They even have a grape that is unique to Japan. The Koshu grape was brought over along the Silk Road, and it leads to very unique, light, and palatable wines that are really quite delicious and different from things that you get elsewhere. They obviously do have their sake, they have their rice wine, and they make beer, but they're developing a niche for themselves within the wine community itself, not as sort of these fringe, either beer or as this, rice wine, which is considered sort of a fringe market. It's very specialized. They have normal wines as well. Normal, they're very different, but they are still really popular. And there's becoming to be a global demand for these Japanese wines outside of just the sake and the beer that they've already been known to produce for a long time. So it'll be interesting to see how they continue to grow that global market and how they continue to incorporate new flavors into their wines. Next, we have Thailand. So Thailand actually has a ton of award-winning wines, in particular sparkling wines. It has a very famous brut, Cuvée de Siam. So Siam is the capital of Thailand, and Chenin Blanc. And all of these have won awards at worldwide wine competitions, international wine competitions, and have become really popular. They have a rapidly expanding market as well, sort of similar to Japan. It seems like a lot of these wines are getting routed through London before they spread to Europe and the Americas. And that's already happening for Thai wines. They already have that established foothold in London. They're present in a lot of places. And it'll be interesting to see if they continue to expand further outwards from there. Additionally, Thailand creates a new scenario in the sense of they are a new latitude wine. So what that means is that most wine is grown between about 30 degrees latitude and 50 degrees latitude, north and south of the equator. And Thailand is not there. They're at about 13 degrees of latitude, which is well outside of that standard range, much closer to the equator. But despite the very different climate that comes along with that, they're able to make some really quality wines. So it'll be interesting to see if there are more of these new latitude wines popping up in the next several years here as the wine industry grows and as more countries begin experimenting with wine. Last up, we have Kenya. Now, Kenya is super interesting because while also being at a different latitude, very close to the equator there, the wine is produced at over 6,500 feet of elevation, which is really high up, and it's right in the Rift Valley, which is actually, in theory, where life originated. So it's poetic almost that they make wine there now, given how many people depend on it. But it's really interesting to see that sort of how that impacts the terroir, and it makes these really unique wines. In particular, they create this incredibly sweet red wine. It's sweeter than probably any red wine you've ever tried. Absolutely delicious, and it's really unique to that region, unique to Kenya. And it's interesting to see. They also make some more standard wines, but that is a pretty unique wine to Kenya, in that it really expresses the nature of the region. And it's been super cool to see that wine develop and gain a little more popularity. Because as Kenya grows its wine industry, it's spreading from being popular more locally in these safari lodges for visitors to try as an oddity, to gaining real overseas traction where people are interested in Kenyan wines and they really want to experiment with them. So what should we take away from all this? Now, while obviously it's great to have wines from your staples, you want your French wines, your Spanish wines, I'm not going to say to stop drinking them, but there are amazing wines being made other places. So it's really just, it's up to you. How much do you want to explore? Because I can promise that however far you want to go, from Tahiti to Madagascar, they are making wines there. And some of them are really high quality. And it'll be interesting to see if some of these wines can make progress and become really something that is palatable for the masses to enjoy in the future. Now, I'd like to thank Professor John Boyer. His geography of wine class allowed for this project to happen. He has taught me everything I knew about wine and everything probably I could ever hope to know about wine. He's just incredible, and he's been really great in helping me go from somebody who had relatively no wine experience to, well, hopefully a little bit. But if you want to learn more, I absolutely recommend checking out his YouTube channels. You can find him, search up The Plaid Avenger on YouTube. And if you want to learn more about wine, I can guarantee you that he has content that can help you learn about wine, about its history, about how it's traveled throughout time, really, and some of the better wines to have, and some of the places that even I may have not gotten to. There are a lot more out there. So I'm going to leave you with this quote: "Wine is bottled poetry." Robert Louis Stevenson said it, and I believe it to be true. So go ahead on out there and find the poem that speaks to you, find the wine that speaks to you, and happy sipping. I'm going to go ahead and pan over to my references slide in case you're interested in doing any further research. If you have any questions, feel free to direct them to me. And again, if you want to learn more about wine, John Boyer has a lot of content that is really incredible and can help you get started learning. Or if you already know something, I guarantee he can teach you something new. So thank you very much for your time. That's all. And I'll see you next time.